Really pleased to welcome you all to the UCLA History Department for what promises to be a very interesting talk of a kind that we don't typically host in the department. But that's, I guess, not unexpected because Carl Jacobi is the kind of historian. We host lots of historians like Carl Jacobi, but he's certainly the kind of historian who does very interesting work. And what's remarkable about the interesting work that he does, it's the diversity of the work that he's done. His first book, which is based on his dissertation at Yale, Crimes Against Nature, Squatters, Poachers, Thieves, and the Hidden History of American Conservation, sort of looked at, basically in the upstate New York, and various other parts of the country, but looked at the sort of the ways in which conservation, the implementation of environmental conservation regimes interfered with the aspirations of working people in the area, the sort of cultures of working people, and the ways in which they contested and resisted the imposition of that new order. His second book, really moving in completely new directions, Shadows at Dawn, a Borderlands Massacre and the Violence of History. Look at a massacre in southeastern,
just southern Arizona.
Southern Arizona, right.
Yeah.
Southern Arizona, but most interestingly looked at it from a variety of perspectives and using a variety of sources to tell the history not from an omniscient single historian author point of view, but to try to tell the history from the points of view of the diverse participants in the massacre and to use the different sources to unpack that. And today he comes to us to speak about the project that I believe most of you are in the room for very personal reasons. The Color Line and the Borderline, locating William Ellis, the Texas slave who became a Mexican millionaire, in the archives and in family history. And it is, of course, this book, which I trust is near and dear to many in this room. And it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Carl Jacobi from Columbia University to the University of California, Los Angeles.
Thank you. Oh, it's hard to follow that introduction. Thanks so much, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I wanted to thank a bunch of folks who made this possible. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, Ben Madley, Steve Aaron, Carla Pastana, and then Ann Major, who's dealt with a lot of questions along the way. And one reason that I pestered poor Ann so much is this, as you'll see, this presentation is a little different and a little more complicated than your normal presentation, than your normal academic lecture. It's going to be something of a curious hybrid creature that's going to try to place the ways that academics think about history along the ways that other non-specialists contemplate the past. And to do that, I'm eventually going to ask a few folks to join me up here at the front of the room, which is why the room is set up this way. My purpose today is not so much to make evaluative judgments about the different ways that people think about the past, that is to argue that one is necessarily superior or inferior. Rather, I hope to do something a bit different, to explore the convergences and divergences between what we might call academic history and family history, with an eye towards illuminating the capaciousness and flexibility of the past and the ways that our many pasts can intrude into our present. That being said, my own point of entry into this project was, I'll confess, rather academic. I'm someone who began graduate school during the ferment of the so-called New Western history, and I was involved in the collective project of rethinking the prominent place of the concept of the frontier in much of the literature about the American past, which eventually led me to the newly developing field of borderlands history. Like all historical models, including the frontier thesis before it, Borderlands grapples with the inherent tension between offering a synoptic way of understanding the past and acknowledging the full diversity, complexity, and frankly quirkiness of human existence. Yet whatever its drawbacks as a paradigm might be, one advance that Borderlands has offered has been its power to expand our angle of vision beyond the nation state, the customary container for thinking about the past ever since history's emergence as an academic discipline in the 19th century. Thus, while the frontier thesis concerned the creation of a unique United States, Borderlands history asks us to re-envision the U.S. as just one of many nations on the North American continent, and to ask how these multiple polities interacted and bled into one another. And I'm sure a lot of you in the room are familiar with Steve's sort of seminal paper about this from the AHR in 1999. If the frontier gives us a single, simple divide, Borderlands offers us instead a world marked by multiple divisions where categories overlap and blur into one another and sometimes fuse to create something new altogether. In this new context, the border crosser is recast not as some odd marginal figure flitting between categories and nations, but in fact as the illustrative figure of his or her era. Yet the very qualities that make the border crosser so alluring for historians can also make them extremely challenging to research. Not only can the documentary record be scattered between various national archives, the border crossers, since they often work at cross purposes with national projects, frequently attempts to conceal their activities, sowing obfuscation, confusion, and uncertainty in their wake. This was certainly the case with the figure at the heart of my recent project, a figure known at the turn of the last century as either William Ellis, Guillermo Ellis, or Guillermo Eliseo. I stumbled across my first reference to him many years ago when I was looking through some State Department records from the 1890s, a series of consul reports from northern Mexico. As is so often the case with historical research, I was not looking for any particular document, but was operating instead in the expectation that if I wanted to chart the U.S. ties with Mexico, the consuls, who were located in most all of the era's significant Mexican cities, would give me an uncommonly useful window onto local events. Alas, most of those events I soon discovered were exquisitely boring, quotidian issues about the U.S. investments or obscure bureaucratic infighting. But suddenly, in what I would term the first of several episodes of serendipity in this story, I turned the page and tumbled into a wealth of documents from 1895 about the attempt to settle close to 1,000 African-American sharecroppers from Alabama and Georgia on an hacienda in Durango, Mexico called Tlahualilo. As the documents made clear, this event triggered a major diplomatic crisis between the U.S. and Mexico, as each country debated who is responsible for the migrants and their care. So here's a shot from one of the government reports about the migrants. It's interesting here, you'll see they identify them not as American citizens, but as refugees. And here's a shot from the hacienda in Tlahualilo. This is it's the most arid region in all of Mexico, in the Bolson de Mapimi. And so they had to do irrigation and undertake these tremendous irrigation projects to grow cotton. This unexpected migration from north to south also sparked considerable commentary in the popular press on both sides of the border. In the US, white observers confronted the unwelcome realization that despite their belief that Mexico was little more than a backward, primitive nation, thousands of African Americans were in fact willing to relocate there rather than to continue to live under the oppressions and injustices of Jim Crow. And there's a very brief mention of this in Hammer and Hoe by Robin Kelly. Alarmed white commentators predicted that this initial resettlement of Durango might be only the first wave of an unprecedented exodus, with the majority of African Americans abandoning the American South for the Mexican North, depriving the U.S. of a vital labor supply. For its part, Mexico sought during these years to emulate the U.S.'s economic success by attracting more immigrants to help unlock the country's rich natural resources. The immigrants that Mexico most desired, however, were the so-called Latins, Catholic Europeans from places like Spain, France, or Italy, not African Americans. Mexican leaders viewed their country as already suffering from a racial problem because of its large Indian population. They aspired to whiten Mexico by bringing in European immigrants. The arrival of scores of African Americans, however, threatened to upend all this, creating new racial problems rather than eliminating old ones. As the Mexico City newspaper El Tiempo observed at the time, modern states, and modern was very much a status Mexico was aspiring to at this time period, modern states work to acquire unity, and allowing the mass migration of African Americans would, at least to those at El Tiempo, undercut Mexico's attempts to create a more unified, modern citizenry. This incident brought many questions to the surface for me. How was it, for example, that Mexico had, by the late 19th century, managed to erase the presence of its own Afro-Mexicano population, the product of New Mexico's participation in the Atlantic slave trade, and cast immigrants of African descent as intruders rather than as representatives of a group with deep roots in Mexico. To what extent were events in Tlahualilo the unexpected melding of two streams of colonization discourse, one traditionally based in the US, which described colonization in terms of the resettlement of African Americans on lands outside the US, another centered in Mexico, which when it spoke of colonization meant the attracting of immigrants to develop northern Mexico. One hears a great deal about Bishop Henry Turner and African American ideas of Africa at this time, but what was the place that Mexico occupied in the African American imagination? Above all, however, I wondered at who it was who had seen previously untapped possibilities in the borderlands as the expanding transcontinental rail system brought the US and Mexico into closer contact with one another than ever before and set this audacious migration plan in motion. And this is just a map from the time period, and I like it just because it's a little bit disorienting, that it's a little hard to see actually where the border is. If you look closely, it's right there. But what's really striking about it is not so much the division with the border, but rather the unification that you're seeing as the railroad is beginning to pierce the border in several ways and opening Mexico up to American capital in a way that had never been possible before. References scattered across stray documents pointed to a man known variously as William Ellis, Guillermo Ellis, or Guillermo Eliseo, who, according to whom you believed, was either a Mexican, a Cuban, or, quote, an intelligent-looking mulatto from Texas. Initially, however, I was not able to resolve the mystery of this uncommon border crosser and his confused, contradictory background. In the meantime, not wanting to abandon what research I had done, I wrote up the findings I did have about the Tlahualilo colony, published them as a short essay, and having hit what seemed like a dead end, moved on to other projects. A few years later, however, while I was out in Los Angeles at the Huntington on a long-term fellowship, I was asked to expand this essay for inclusion in an anthology on new approaches to Borderlands history. As I revised, I made another attempt at solving some of the mysteries swirling around William Ellis, Guillermo Eliseo, or whoever he was. Fortunately, thanks to the newspaper holdings at the Huntington, as well as its full run of city directories from Manhattan, I was able to figure out that there was someone known as William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo living in New York City in the early 20th century who was a considerable presence on Wall Street, involved in the flood of American investment into Mexico during the Porfiriato. And as I'm sure most of you know, Porfiriato refers to the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. And he's the Mexican leader who's the architect of what might be called sort of Mexico's defensive modernization, which is to say opening up Mexico's economy just enough to foreign investment so that Mexico can be stronger, but also sort of stave off more aggressive attempts at US control during this time period. There were various clues that this William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo on Wall Street was the same individual who had been behind the 1895 effort to resettle African Americans on the colony in Tlahualilo. Feeling rather pleased with myself for having solved more of the puzzle, I wrote up these new findings, which were published in 2004 in the anthology Continental Crossroads from Duke University Press and edited by my good friends Sam Truitt and Elliot Young. What I did not realize at the time, however, was that I was much, much closer to solving the mystery altogether, and that the key to the mystery was not in New York or Mexico City, the two great North American metropolises where William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo spent most of his life, but instead right here in the Los Angeles area. Instead, I quickly became consumed with another project altogether, one on the violence of the Indian Wars in the Borderlands, which was released in 2008 as Shadows Against Dawn, a Borderlands massacre and the violence of history. Not until after Shadows at Dawn was published did I return once again to the mystery of the man known as William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo. In the meantime, a digital revolution began to sweep over the archives, transforming the research process. Whereas just a few years before, I had scrolled through newspapers on microfilm, trying to spot stories about William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo, and hoping that my eyes did not glaze over in the process. Now I could put various versions of his name into databases that encompass scores of newspapers and find references to him popping up in all sorts of places. Moreover, census data had been digitized as well, making the tracing of William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo across the decades far easier than ever before. One of the most significant features of the census, of course, is that it serves as a mechanism through which racial status is determined in the US. The Census Bureau instructed its enumerators as they went door to door to assign everyone a racial category. In the 1910 census, for example, enumerators were given the following options: W for white, B for black, MU for mulatto, CH for Chinese, JP for Japanese, IN for American Indian, or OT for other. Here's how the figure known variously as William Ellis or Guillermo Eliseo appears in the 1910 census. So I'm not going to try to make you read that, but you know, historians love documents, so I had to show you the whole document. But if you see where that pink sort of point is here, you can see there he is. And if we read across here, what am I finding? Yeah, so he's W, he's, where are we? M for male, W for white, he's 45. You can see his parents were born in Mexico, they're Spanish. He emigrated in 1869, he does speak English. You can also see, if you look at the sort of household, that he's the head of a household here. He's married, he has a wife, he has several children here as well. He's living, in fact, at the time in Mount Vernon, New York, which is one of the first suburbs of Westchester, and at the time it's quite a Tony and, in fact, virtually all-white town. Building on such findings, I also located documents such as the birth certificate for Guillermo Eliseo's oldest son, born in New York City in 1904 when his parents were living at 300 Central Park West, then is now an elite address in Manhattan. The building still exists actually, and it's called El Dorado, which seems like the appropriate name for a wealthy Latin American to live in El Dorado. The elite address itself is not much of a surprise, since Eliseo was, as you can see here on his the birth certificate for his eldest son, he's listed as a banker and broker. And the certificate, at least initially, seemed to clarify a little bit of the confusion about the name, so that you see here on the edge, this is his son Enrique Eliseo Jr., but they also call him William Henry Ellis Jr. And so it would seem that basically William Henry Ellis is a translation from Spanish of his name Guillermo Enrique Eliseo, presumably for the ease of his new English-speaking acquaintances. Birth certificates, like the census, and even more so than the census, are also machines for creating race. And so the important thing to note here is that, once again, the race is indicated as white. White, mother English, father Mexican. So far so good, yet the accessibility of the census data online also opened up a riddle. If I followed the paper trail backwards, I ended up not where I expected in Mexico, but across the border in Texas. Moreover, Guillermo Eliseo did not appear to be Mexican at all. Instead, he shows up in the 1880 census as living in Victoria, a small town in southern Texas. So here's the big page from Victoria, and here's the for his family. And in 1880, the census takers recorded his race with an MU here for mulatto, as was the case for the rest of his family as well. If the Guillermo Eliseo that we encounter several decades later in New York was dwelling in fancy residences like El Dorado on Central Park West and in suburban Westchester County, the young William Ellis was living in considerably more prosaic circumstances in 1880. His father was a warehouse man, and his grandmother, who lived with the family, was a washerwoman, cleaning other people's dirty laundry. If we go even farther back, the family's circumstances become even more modest. In the 1870 census, the father is listed as a shoemaker. William Ellis, now nicknamed Willie, is going to school. And in the 1860 census, the Ellis family does not appear at all, except as nameless tallies in the slave schedule, which recorded age and gender, but not name, since at the time, in the eyes of the US, the members of the Ellis family were property, not persons. Clearly something odd was afoot. While I had some guesses that what we were seeing was a real-life Great Gatsby, a young man from a humble background who changed his name and chased wealth and fame in New York City, I realized that the only way I was going to be able to tell close to the complete tale was to track down some of William Ellis's living relatives in the hopes that they might know something of their family history and explain how it was that an African American named William Ellis from Victoria, Texas, born into slavery, was able to persuade so many influential folks that he was in fact a wealthy Mexican banker and broker named Guillermo Eliseo. The trouble was that Ellis's widow and children disappeared from the census and other US records completely after 1925. Despite my best efforts, I could not locate them until, in another stroke of serendipity, I crossed paths with a professional genealogist who suggested that rather than continuing my fruitless efforts to find Ellis and his immediate family, I track his siblings. And you can see here, he has several siblings: Fanny, Hezekiah, Avalonia, Isabella. So I tracked them instead. And this trail led me first to San Antonio, where many members of the family relocated in the 1880s. The trail then took an unexpected turn west. Most of the family moved once again during the Great Migration to Los Angeles. The family originally settled along Central Avenue in downtown Los Angeles, but later generations moved, I was stunned to discover, to Pasadena and Altadena, remarkably close to the neighborhood where I'd been living during my fellowship at the Huntington Library. Indeed, one of the members of the family, Susie Williams, who's here in the audience today, literally lived 2 blocks from the house of friends of ours in Altadena. I'd driven by Susie's house multiple times, not knowing that if I were to stop, knock on her door, and ask her about the enigmatic William Ellis, all of these mysteries that had so consumed me would have been solved years earlier. For me, this close call stands as an eerie reminder of all the missed connections involved in any historical enterprise, as well as highlighting how embedded we are in history, even if we are not always conscious of all the ways that it touches us. As James Baldwin once observed, whether we like it or not, history is literally present in all that we do. After I established contact with the family, we engaged in a flurry of revelations. I shared with them the short articles I'd written about William Ellis, as well as all the other documents I'd managed to accumulate. They in turn shared with me several family photos and letters of William Ellis, which offered a more personal view of him than I've been able to locate so far. And I just wanted to share 3 of these with you really quickly. This is a photo of William Ellis here with his father and then his 2 children who are dressed just beautifully, sort of like Little Lord Fauntleroy. It's a little bit hard to read here, but this photo was actually taken in Mexico City. And so it seems to me that William Ellis, obviously this is proof that he still stayed in contact with his family, but the only way to really do that safely outside of the gaze of the hostile white world was to meet in Mexico, right, where people wouldn't necessarily see him. This here is a photo of William Ellis's office on Wall Street. If you can sort of read the reverse there, you see Mexican and Cuban, what's that say, investments. This photo always gives me tremendous sort of angst as a historian because I just see papers piled up everywhere. Who knows what happened to those, but just all the sorts of this evidence that is completely inaccessible to me as a historian. It's very frustrating. And this is one of the few pieces of evidence that I do have, which is one of the stock certificates. William Ellis had a whole, maybe at one point about 15 different corporations that were all involved in different ways in Mexico. And so we do have a few of these certificates like this. At this point, I decided I had unearthed enough material to write a book about this fascinating border crosser, but before I did, I concluded it was only proper that I get the family's permission to do my project. Doing so was perhaps an eccentric decision on my part. Legally, as historians, we enjoy the academic freedom to write about most anything that we want. I'm an ardent supporter of this approach, which is intended to prevent the powerful from being able to censor research that they might find embarrassing or inconvenient. Historical transparency is not just an academic nicety in this view, but rather a fundamental feature of a democratic society, for it allows all of us to see how the decisions that affect us get made. Nevertheless, the ethical compass takes on a different dimension when the object of one's study is not some powerful politician or business person, but rather an obscure former slave who is engaged in a virtuoso act of reinvention in the face of a society that would otherwise deny him his full measure of humanity. Since I would be exposing long-buried secrets, I wanted to make sure that the family was supportive of my undertaking. So after a number of phone calls and emails, I flew out to Los Angeles several years ago to meet with them in person, and I can now confess that I did so with at least a little anxiety, for if the family opposed my writing a book, which would have been completely reasonable, frankly, for them to have done, I would end up jettisoning years of hard-won research, but I'd rather do that than be involved in a tense battle with them over who had the right to tell William Ellis's story. Fortunately, in what I might term the greatest episode of serendipity in this project, the family announced that they were enthusiastic, in fact, about my writing a book that would collect and distill much of their family history and allow it to be shared with later generations. The only request they made of me was that I write any book about William Ellis quickly, as the three sisters who serve as the guiding spirits of the extended family were at the time in their mid to late 70s and wanted to see the book's publication. I'm not sure they knew exactly what they were asking of me, for as many of you know here, academic scholarship is a profoundly slow process that often measures itself in decades, but I'm pleased to report that the book was published just this summer, as Steve referenced, and at least two of the sisters, Susie and Joan, are with us today. Fanny, I hope, will be with us soon. And they're here in the audience, and they're actually going to join us for the question and answer session. When I met with the family in Pasadena, one of the first questions I asked them was why it had such trouble tracking Ellis's widow and children after his death. The answer, it turned out, could be found in one of the letters that they shared with me. Ellis's survivors had moved to Mexico City in the 1920s in an effort to reclaim the fortune he'd lost during the Mexican Revolution. What was expected to be only a short visit, however, turned into a permanent stay as the claim process dragged on and the family created new lives for themselves in Mexico. And over time, the two branches of the family had lost touch with one another. Once I had this clue, and feeling pretty proud of myself for having located Ellis's grandnieces, I promised the family I'd track down their missing Mexican relatives. And that took me several years, and I'm sure there's lots of times when they thought I was never going to do this, and there's lots of times I thought I was never going to do it. It was very hard given how many fewer Mexican census records are online. But nonetheless, after several years and considerable serendipity, I was able to track down Ellis's grandchildren, Peter, Andrea, and Leticia, and they've also joined us here today. So this is like a history talk, but also a family reunion of sorts. Historians have been consumed for at least a generation with questions about the tensions between history and memory as distinct, even antagonistic ways of understanding the past. As the historian Richard White so vividly put it, only careless historians confuse history and memory. History is the enemy of memory. The two stalk each other across the fields of the past, claiming the same terrain. History forges weapons from what memory has forgotten or suppressed. But it seems to me there's another related but distinct divide in imagining the past that we have spent far less time plumbing, that between genealogy and history. If memory is at once solid yet unsubstantial, rooted in physical objects like monuments and memorials and museums, yet also floating free in inchoate stories about the past, genealogy, like history and unlike memory, valorizes empiricism, discrete documentable facts that can be traced to specific historical documents. Many of these documents, in fact, are the same ones as are used by historians, the census, city directories, newspaper obituaries, and indeed you've seen abundant evidence of my reliance on these sources in this talk today. But whereas genealogy tends to be particularistic, to be concerned with tracing a certain family's lineage across time and distinguishing this one thread from the rest of the human tapestry in which it's embedded, history seeks instead to describe the general, to tug at whatever thread in the past we've selected, with the goal of helping us to see anew the larger fabric of human existence. I don't, alas, have time to speak on all the insight that William Ellis's strange career offers us, but as a historian, what was immediately compelling to me about his life was the way it cast into sharp relief the two preeminent phenomena of his age, the color line and the borderline. Paradoxically, Ellis's remarkable ability to subvert these efforts at control demonstrates both the color lines and the borderline's abiding power and their unexpected fragility. As a former slave, Ellis started life with next to nothing, but by growing up near the border and by learning fluent Spanish from the Mexican field hands alongside whom he picked cotton, he acquired a certain cultural capital that allowed him to operate comfortably in Mexico and to present himself as Mexican while in the US. Undermining the color line was thus not simply a question of phenotype, but also of language, dress, behavior, and the like. And I'm often asked what William Ellis looked like, and there's really no easy answer. You've gotten a few photos so far. But even with the objective technology of the camera, I think that often the images tend to vary a little bit. So what I have here is a gallery of several images, and I'm going to start with a few drawings from newspapers and then take you to some photos. And I think what's really significant about all of these is the way that Ellis was largely perceived in keeping with what an elite Latin American at the time would look like. So when he's claiming to be Mexican, he's not claiming to be a peon. He's not claiming to be a Mexican field hand. He's claiming to be a sort of elite member of the Porfiriato. So here's a drawing from New York World in the early 1900s. And he looks like the Monopoly man a little bit too, right? He's kind of the classic figure of the capitalist, right? Even the wrong kind of hat, though. Even down to the stoutness of his build, which again was at the time period really signified someone who was well fed and enjoyed all the best things in life, and came from a wealthy background. Here's another drawing pretty similar from the same time period. Another drawing which weirdly looks a lot like Teddy Roosevelt to me in this one. And here's an early photo which looks quite dashing, like I don't know, young Errol Flynn or something. Here he is, one of my favorite photos, and the newspaper reviews of the book that came out, it seemed like all the newspaper reviewers liked this image. This is the image that they wanted to include. And I think it's just a great example of how he's consciously using dress, to really signify an elite status, right? It isn't simply just your phenotype, but it's the way that you dress and you carry yourself. Here's another photo. Again, exquisitely dressed. Here he is. Here this is even the chair seems to be a important piece of stagecraft. And this is from a more candid photo. And this is interesting. It's very hard, once you know William Ellis's story, to kind of unsee him or to not see him with the American racial gaze. But to me, frankly, he looks fairly African American in that photo. And it's really striking to me that people could see someone who, in some images, looks like that, and I guess in some encounters, some light might look like that, and end up perceiving him like that, right? But I think that they did, seemingly as a testament to the way that he was actually able to shape his self-image. Now, one other reason that so many whites in the US were so willing to believe that William Ellis, the ex-slave, was actually Guillermo Eliseo, the wealthy Mexican banker, is that he understood how to play to his audience's desires. Much of the Gilded Age's booming consumer economy depended on one way or another on raw materials from Mexico. Mexican copper for wires to carry electricity or the new technology of the phone calls, Mexican rubber and oil for the newly invented automobile, even Mexican chicle for chewing gum and Mexican chocolate for candy bars and Mexican vanilla for vanilla ice cream, all of these new treats for the rising urban masses. This made Mexico an object of fascination for American capitalists and made Guillermo Eliseo a useful figure to know, for he was someone who could facilitate US investment south of the border. Under these circumstances, why would anyone want to dig too deeply under the facade that Ellis had created for himself? This situation enabled Ellis to become arguably the first African American on Wall Street, with an office next to J.P. Morgan, the preeminent investment banker of the Gilded Age, even if most people at the time, of course, did not realize Ellis's African-American background. Ironically, while in Mexico, Ellis did not portray himself as a Mexican, which would, after all, not have been a particularly useful pose to adopt in a country already full of Mexicans. Instead, he took pains to present himself as an American businessman, sometimes intimating that he was the illegitimate son of Collis P. Huntington and involved with his father's railroad ventures in Mexico. When I told the folks at the Huntington about this, they were very, surprised. Thus, Ellis did not hope to blur boundaries and drain them of meaning so much as rework them to his own ends. He grasped that by being a foreigner in whatever nation he happened to be inhabiting at the moment, he could step outside of the prevailing racial regime. It was a clever move, but it must have also been a lonely one at times, for it meant that he was a perpetual outsider, never truly at home in either nation. And the one possible exception, and sadly one that I don't have much more time to talk about here, but we could explore during question and answer if people want, would be the fascinating detour that he took in the early 1900s into Ethiopia, at the time the only independent nation in Africa, and a place that loomed large in African American thought as a diasporic homeland of sorts. And in Ethiopia, Ellis played on his African American background to build a bond with the Ethiopian Emperor Menelik, pictured here. I don't have any photos of Ellis and Menelik together, but this was taken within just a few days of when Ellis actually, he's the first African American to go to Ethiopia, a few days of when he showed up there. Ellis's status as a perpetual outsider echoed the situation of peoples of African descent in both the US and Mexico at this time. Although we don't often narrate the history of North America on a macro scale, if we did, we could see that, in fact, in both the US and Mexico experienced existential crises in the mid-19th century. In the US, of course, this would be the Civil War. In Mexico, this would be the War of Reform and then the closely connected French intervention, which is sort of a second attempt to colonize Mexico. In the aftermath of these crises, each went through parallel processes of national restructuring and reinvention. In the US, of course, this is usually called Reconstruction. In Mexico, it's the Porfiriato. In trying to create more coherent nation states out of diverse human communities, both the US and Mexico relied upon ideas of race, although in quite distinct ways. In the US, policymakers attempted to create ever more distinct taxonomies of racial difference, segregating and stigmatizing African Americans and denying them their rights as citizens. In Mexico, in contrast, there was a growing celebration of the idea of mestizaje, or racial mixing. The mestizo, however, came to be defined as a mixture of Spanish and Indian, erasing Mexico's considerable Afro-Mexicano presence, which dated all the way to the earliest stages of the colonial period. In both countries, in other words, peoples of African descent established the limits of national belonging, but they did so in quite different ways. In the US, through exclusion, and in Mexico, through erasure. This, in turn, explains my not-so-subtle homage to C. Vann Woodward in the title to the book, The Strange Career of William Ellis. For the book might be thought of as exploring the rise of Jim Crow, albeit on using a transnational perspective rather than Woodward's national one. Given the different concepts of race in the US and Mexico, crossing the border as Ellis did so often during these years meant that one moved not only from one nation to the other, but from one racial regime to another. As Langston Hughes observed in the early 20th century, it was strange to find that just by stepping across an invisible line into Mexico, a Negro could buy a beer in any bar, sit anywhere in the movies, or eat in any restaurant, so suddenly did Jim Crow disappear. For those who ventured back into the US, the reverse was true. Perpetually one of the most fraught moments for Ellis was when he crossed the border into Texas, which, unlike Mexico, attempted to segregate blacks and whites in all facets of daily existence. And this sets up the opening scene for the book, which is set right here in Eagle Pass, Texas, which is right across the border from Piedras Negras, Coahuila, Mexico. 1909, William Ellis is crossing the border on this train here, which runs right here on this train track. And as soon as he gets into Texas, there's this big question. He's been in the first class Pullman car out of Mexico City, but can he stay in the Pullman car or not? Because they're trying to figure out what race is he, where does he belong in the US racial system. Today, most of us probably do not spend much of our time thinking about the differences in how race was conceptualized across the US-Mexico border, but it was something that both Americans and Mexicans were acutely aware of from the mid-19th century onwards. During Reconstruction, for example, many whites in the US used Mexico's seeming instability to argue against social and political equality for the US's recently liberated slaves. As the Texan politician John Henniger Reagan maintained, the, quote, stubborn and sincere opposition of many of his fellow whites to extending voting rights to freedmen, quote, could be sustained by pointing to Mexico, where by the enfranchisement of the Indians and Negroes, they have been deprived of the blessings of order and peace and good government. For their part, Mexicans looked across the board at the violence engulfing the US during Reconstruction and drew a far different lesson, one that celebrated Mexico's having avoided the bitter racial conflicts gripping the US. Observe the Mexico City newspaper El Siglo XIX. We Spanish Americans have had the virtue of resolving, long before the Anglo-Americans, the difficult problem of slavery and the political equality of our races and castas. A little bit of wishful thinking, but also a little bit true in relationship to Reconstruction. As neighboring North American republics, in other words, the US and Mexico each found the other to be a potent foil, a mirror of sorts in which one could glimpse one's imagined other, and in so doing, oneself as well. In portraying itself as a white nation unlike mongrel Mexico, the US obscured the existence of its many non-white residents, not to mention the racial mixing and passing that rendered the very notion of a pure white race untenable. And in casting itself as a mestizo nation of Spanish and Indian origin, unmarred by the slavery that had fueled the violent land grabs of its northern neighbor, Mexico erased the presence of its considerable Afro-Mexicano population. This process of cross-border differentiation was something that William Ellis not only sought to manipulate to his own ends. As the Gilded Age's leading advocate of African-American migration to Mexico, he helped to set it in motion, as in the 1895 colony in Tlahualilo, with which I opened my talk. We can therefore see that although the borderline may be geographically peripheral to both the US and Mexico, it is functionally and culturally central to each nation, especially to their respective ideas of race. Through the alchemy of the historical process, William Ellis has been given a rebirth of sorts, offering lessons to present-day academics about how the periphery defined the core and the borderline shaped the color line, while simultaneously serving as a mechanism for a long-delayed family reunion, bringing together two sides of a family that have been separated by the US-Mexico border for close to a century. Thank you very much. So I think the plan is to have some folks join me up front. Yes? All right, so we've never tried this exactly before, but we thought it would be more interesting than just hearing me talk about the history. There's a lot of people here who also know the history and have thought about the history a lot. And I thought it would be great if they could also answer some of your questions. So we need a brave soul to actually start the question process.
Well, can we get introductions?
Oh yes, should I try? So I will try to introduce, do you guys want to introduce yourselves? Should we do it that way?
Oh, yes, I can. I'm Susie Williams.
And would be William Ellis's grandniece.
Well, I was going to say I'm
Yes.
his grandniece. He was my grandmother's brother.
And I am Robert Williams, Chip also. I am the great-great nephew of William Ellis. His sister was my great-grandmother. Great-grandmother. This is my mother, Joan, Susie's.
Now, where do you all hail from?
Pasadena.
Pasadena.
Los Angeles, and then everyone moved to Pasadena.
Okay.
I am Joan Moore Williams, and I'm at a disadvantage here because I have hearing aids and my batteries ran out while my batteries are in the car on the parking lot.
So I'm here.
He's going to interpret for me, and I'll answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, it's just a bent to
Sorry.
My name is Peter Ellis, and I am a grandson of William Henry Ellis. We live in Mexico City.
Wow. Welcome.
The same. My name is Leticia Ellis, and I'm granddaughter. And I'm Andrea Ellis. I'm sister of Peter and Andrea, and
Granddaughter.
granddaughter
Granddaughter.
from William Ellis.
Yeah. Oh, great.
Yeah, Robin, do you wanna?
Yeah. So I guess I'll be the brave soul to ask one question.
Yes, please.
So there are two questions, one for the family and one for you, Carl. Just for the family, I'm really curious what you heard growing up about William Ellis, stories that you heard. Just, I'm curious if you could share that. And then also, you can't drop that picture about Ethiopia.
Oh.
And you have to tell us more about
I
that
will,
story,
okay.
why you went. And of course, I know you can say, which is legitimate to say, it's in the book. Make sure you buy it. Make sure you buy it. But you can just give us a little more.
I'd be happy to do that, but why don't you guys go first?
What I heard about my Uncle Willie was he was very mysterious. And in those years when we were growing up, children were to be seen and not heard. So whenever they talked about Uncle Willie and some of his exploits, we kind of had to leave the room. So there was always this mystery of who was this fella. And of course, we would see these pictures. The picture that Carl has of him with the cape and the high hat, and well, just who is this guy? And so I can't tell you how delighted I was. One day I was speaking over on SC's campus and just happened to talk about my family coming from Texas, and somehow mentioning my Uncle Willie. And then the next thing I know, after a few weeks, I get a phone call from a historian at SC asking me if it's okay for him to give my phone number to this historian who's been at Brown University, and I said sure. So we had a kind of conference call. I invited my sisters over, and we had this conference call and put the phone there, and he'd ask us these very pertinent questions, and I think we could answer many of them for him, so he realized we were the real thing. But was just marvelous about this whole thing, and of course the book is wonderful, but to find this family after all these years, that we always wondered what happened to Uncle Willie's children, what happened to his grandchildren. They've got to be somewhere. And then to find out that they were just down the road in Mexico, because we were all born in Los Angeles, and so it was just wonderful.
I'd like to say that in my generation, especially my cousin Wesley, Susie's son, and I, we loved hearing these stories about Uncle Willie, because there were these amazing photographs that we saw, and then somehow he was connected to Emperor Menelik, and somehow he was on Wall Street and passed as a Mexican, sometimes Cuban. It was really fascinating. And I have to say that it gave me a sense of having some kind of rich connection to a broader world. And I've traveled extensively in my life, and I think that story of Uncle Willie has given me a lot of the push to go out and see the world and be a part of that. We went to UCLA together, you know that?
No,
Your sister's a good friend.
Okay.
Yes, we always heard a lot of history about my grandpa, because my father used to tell us, but I don't know if he really knew all what he had done, or maybe he didn't know about the slavery situation. I don't know if he even know if that he was a African American. I almost sure that he knew, but we are not sure. One of the pictures that Carl showed here, I have the original, and he looked like a Negro. And once I was with my father, I was around 10 years old, and I told him, this guy is a Negro. No, I mean I don't know if he is descended from African Americans. You can tell it just by seeing it. And he kept silent. He didn't say yes or no. So I don't know. No? He said that he had a very strong character, but my grandmother had a more stronger. So they said one day they were having supper at night, and all my father and my uncles and my aunt were at the table. They were small children, and my grandfather was sit down at the table, and they were fighting, my grandmother and my grandfather. And suddenly my grandmother kept silent, and she took the milk and went around him, spilled it all over. And he said nothing. He said, go to your room to all the children. So my grandmother had stronger character. You remember something?
I remember one thing, but have Spanish and have English. No. When my father told us that when someday they were in his house, and some friends of my grandfather came to the house, and so my grandmother, Mom, told them, "Oh, how are you, cabrones?" It's a very bad word in Spanish. It's a very bad word. And so my grandfather was like this. Why are you telling them like that? Well, because you're a gentleman, and I don't think you can say some kind of words in front of a lady. So I want to tell them that, like you. How are you, cabrones?
She tried to speak in Spanish because my grandfather spoke Spanish pretty well. So when their Mexican friends arrived, he said hello in Spanish with a lot of bad words. So then my grandmother wanted to be nice, and she repeat everything. And you, Andrea?
No, I only remember that when we were young, adolescentes, we asked my father, we want to go to live to New York or to United States because we want to study, and no, United States, no. Why? He was like this, and he said, no, we are not going there because I don't want. And one day, one of our children wanted to have the visa or something, and we tried to look for if he has ID or something to demonstrate that he was North American, my father or my grandfather, and he said that there was nothing, any paper, any nothing, and we said, what's going on? We don't know if he was a spy or spy or something. We don't know. Yeah, we thought really that he was from the CIA or something like that.
So there were secrets, but not
yes,
the CIA secret.
Many secrets.
So Ethiopia, I'll try to be brief here. In the early 1900s, William Ellis is in London, and he meets some of the representatives of the Empire of Ethiopia, and he gets an invitation to go. And I think he sees it as William Ellis has been perpetually trying to create a sort of black homeland in Mexico, and that's for various reasons that gets stalled. And so I think he thinks, oh, I can finally do this in Ethiopia. And so he ends up going there, and the story is so long, in a very interesting and complicated way, ends up actually prefiguring the treaty negotiations between the U.S. and Ethiopia. And so in an odd way, he's often passing as Mexican, but in this case, he's also passing as a diplomat. And so he's the first American or African American to go to Ethiopia, and he inserts himself into the treaty making process. That's all I'll say right now. Other than that, buy the book. There's a lot more. So who should we?
Well, just as Robin focused on Ethiopia, I want to focus on the certificate, the stock certificate.
Right, okay.
And the construction company. I'm interested in the business side of this man and the acquisition of his skills, and Wall Street at this time. Because I was wondering, I just took a look at your book, Carl, so I'm not sure, but were any of the stories that you heard around the family table, or any of the skills that you may have acquired through osmosis, the financial skills that this man possessed? Where did he acquire them? And his use of them to work the Wall Street at a time when Limantour in Mexico was essentially growing this economy, lots of Wall Street bankers, but he had the diplomatic ties as well. So I'm really curious about, I guess, his business, and were there not traces with the stock? Anybody got any more stock certificates, or how, could you get at that a little bit more, or family stories about the business connection that I find fascinating?
Well, I have a lot of stocks in my office,
Okay.
and many years ago, around 30 years ago, I studied at New York, and I spent there 1 year. And I went to Wall Street and took all the stocks and tried to find out if they had some value. And they searched for 1 week, and they just told me, put them in a frame. And I did. And I put them there. But they are very interesting because there are trains, mines, there's also a light company,
Yes.
Toluca Light Company.
Right.
And this,
What was all stolen
This-
from during the Mexican Revolution?
It was nationalized.
the gas company
Yeah,
and light company.
The light
they were
company,
nationalized, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, not,
Oh,
okay. But to address where he gained his business acumen, when he was in Victoria, perhaps San Antonio, I believe Victoria, he worked as an apprentice with an Irish immigrant trader in cowhide, or German, was he?
No, he's Irish.
Irish. So this Irishman was trading with Mexicans and also with the local community, but he had a pretty strong accent, and William Ellis was his mouthpiece, sort of. So kind of just by being in the position of doing the negotiations for him, going through the motions of speaking for him, he learned trade and became rather fluent in the language of business. And he realized at a certain point, well, why am I doing this for him? I can do this for myself. I speak Spanish, I speak English. When I cross the border, people don't know who or what I am, so it worked out for him that way.
The only other thing I want to add to all that is that, and this is sort of the historiographical point that I think is interesting, which is that when we think about borderlands history, we think about Texas and California, but it's really interesting to think that Wall Street was actually at the center in some ways. That Wall Street can be thought of as a borderland space during the Gilded Age, because as you noted, Wall Street is so immensely invested in Mexico, and so in fact, when I did the records of all the companies that have investments in Mexico, most of them are based in New York City during this time period. It's not California or Texas, it's actually New York City. So one of the small moves in the book is just trying to think about New York City as a borderlands space that's really closely tied to Mexico. So Steve, you want to?
Well, a question actually. I'm sorry in some ways that I wish Brenda Stevenson were here today.
Oh, okay.
She's on leave, so she's
yes.
away. But she, after her Latasha Harlan's book came out, had done some events in which family members were, and it was not as comfortable as this gathering between historian and family members seems to be. And so I'm curious, not to stir trouble, but as far as you did invoke during your talk, one, the importance that you wanted to sort of gain their approval, but then you also spoke about the differences between history and memory.
Right.
And the difference between the way the historian works and the documents that we sort of draw on to put together our interpretive frameworks, and the ways in which family memories play. So I guess for the family and for the historian, I would ask, were there any points in the book in which the historian's record sort of really contradicted or surprised or challenged family memories in ways, where what Carl uncovered really went against the sort of lore that, the stories you were told and were passed down in your family about William Ellis?
That's a good question. I'll let you guys go first, and then I'll start.
I don't think that there's anything that Carl wrote or uncovered that was especially surprising for this North American side of the family. We're certainly familiar with what goes into passing. So that the fact that he passed, the fact that he had to live a double life was not something that was new to us. It wasn't offensive at all. We knew that history.
And I would just like to say that he didn't really have to pass, because people today assume because you aren't very black, or you don't have kinky hair, or you don't fit what the media has said black people are, that you couldn't possibly be black. And yet it happens to our family all the time.
He allowed people to assume whatever he was.
Yeah.
And so he used that to his advantage. I'd also like to say that there is a term in African American folklore called the trickster, right? Yeah. My mother and my aunts were not familiar with that term, and they didn't quite like the term trickster, but I tried to explain that was like Brer Rabbit used situations to his advantage, and that's what the trickster is. Not a bad characterization, but someone who maneuvered things. One thing that we did take issue with was not from Carl's writing at all, but one of the reviewers called him a con man. And that is a cultural sort of misunderstanding of why people passed in the first place. I mean, what chance did he have of self-actualization as a former slave? So he saw what advantages he had to work the system to realize his full potential as he saw fit for himself. And I start out with nothing. I go to university and I get a degree in this, and I learn AutoCAD to do that or the other thing, and I take my high school graduate self and appropriate things that will advance me in life, and he did that culturally, So at the time, that was what he had to work with.
Susie, do you want to say
Well, I think Carl knows much better my grandfather, us. But from a personal point of view, I think that I admire a lot to my grandfather, of course, but I feel based in what my father said and my aunt, William Henry had a daughter called Vicky that she lived 98 years, and she just died a few years ago. 10 years ago, and we live a lot with her, and she didn't express very well about Henry. She said that she was too far away from the family. He traveled a lot, and he was angry all the time. He was too serious. So it's a little shocking to me to see what a big man and rich guy and famous can be, and in the other hand, with his family, maybe he was not so happy. So it is very interesting to, and by the other hand, it's difficult to judge because 50, 80 years, it's very difficult to know exactly what happened in that family.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I belong over here.
Yes, Fanny, take my seat.
No, just say, I'm first Fanny. I'm Fanny, and these are my sisters. And I just have to let you know when he asked that question, is that here was a man that we didn't know in our lifetime. But we learned about him, and he became alive to us because his sister, Fanny, from whom I'm named, made him come alive because she talked about her brother, and she told the stories of his life, even about when they were young, picking cotton together. She told stories about his adventures throughout the world. And she painted him as this elegant, intelligent man who, as we see, as you learn about him, he found a way out of no way. He found a way to use what he had, his intelligence, to take advantage of opportunities and to see the world as an open border. And that it was fortunate that he could just work on both sides, and he did that. But what you have to know about him is, in all that, I never internalized him as passing, although we know that, but I just saw him as this man who was exotic and intellectual, and he just took advantage of the way he had to legitimize himself in a sense. But in doing that, he never forgot his family. He always, and this is what my grandmother shared with us, letters that he wrote, always to the family saying, well, in fact, he would say, Papa. In fact, he sent this letter when he was on that RMS Lusitania, when he was on his way to Ethiopia. I have sent money to you. Just go to the banker. It's there for you because I want you to know, Papa, if anything happens to me or happens to you, you are protected. Another telegram came and said, Papa, Happy New Year to all you. Tell Sister Isabel and Avalonia and so forth, Happy New Year. And please take flowers to Mama's grave and tell her and put on it, it's from her boy, Willie. And that's how he called himself to his siblings, Willie. So, and even he went to the point of saying, another letter, how's that little sister Isabella mine and that no good husband of hers? And you know, he was quite concerned because he sent Isabel to Northwestern University where she couldn't go and stay in a dorm. And he sent money when she married, but he kept sending money and saying that no good husband isn't taking care of her. And please, let her come home and live with you, but not that no good husband. So if you could, you know, follow some of the letters, you could see his connection to his family, even though he had a whole nother life too. You know. So I just wanted to share with you. I'm sorry I'm late. I had an emergency and had to go to the hospital, so I'm here though.
I'll just add a couple of quick points. I mean, what I did is I shared a rough draft of the book with them, with the understanding that not that they could, you know, edit it for me, but that I wanted to get their feedback on the book, and if there were any concerns that I addressed them. I do think the use, as Chip pointed out, the trickster image was something that we had to kind of talk through a little bit. What struck me more was simply the fact that there are certain, and this is what's revealing about this sort of memory versus history aspect, is that there were certain stories that they knew really well, so that they knew that Uncle Willie had gone to Ethiopia. They didn't know that he was potentially involved in a murder when he was going to Ethiopia. They knew that he had been on Wall Street, but they didn't know that he was potentially involved in assault on Wall Street. So there's sort of other stories about him that's interesting about what gets remembered and the other stories that don't get remembered. I think that's what really came clear to me in comparing the two. So, more questions?
There's been mentioned a few times about passing, and I found myself in a similar situation, only the reverse here a few years ago. I had retired from the Army, and when Vietnam came along, why they needed some people, so I volunteered to go back on active duty. And when I went in, I think the California law at the time I was originally drafted was 16-1. And so there at the top of my, I don't know what they call it, a personnel form or anything, was the big N up there. And the clerk that was taking care of me was, standard, dark complected gentleman, and African American, and he looks at that, and he looks at me, and he looks back, and he says, "What's this N doing here?" And he quickly got out the white out and erased it and put a big old C there. So, because by that time, of course, there were some advantages in racial differences. But these things happen, and it happens both ways.
Was it like a challenge to his status to like be in New York City and like advocate for this like African American resettlement in Mexico? Because it seems pretty risky or ballsy to do that.
It is. I mean, yes, the short answer is yes. And I think that's one reason that I know about him, because if you think about it, someone who did this perfectly, who passed perfectly, would be invisible, I think virtually invisible to the historian.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's continually has some engagement with African American politics means that he's continually at risk of sort of letting the mask drop away and people beginning to perceive his what his birth identity would be. In fact, what happens is when he first, as Chip referenced, he grows up in this small town in South Texas called Victoria. He first moves to San Antonio. It's San Antonio where he first passes. And then he's deeply involved in colonization efforts in Mexico. And eventually, because of those, he basically gets outed. So that in all of the San Antonio directories, they would put a C for colored after you if they thought you were colored. And so for years, he doesn't have that C. And then finally, he does get that C. And that's the year he leaves San Antonio. Like he just goes, and he goes to New York City. And I think he tries again, and I think he's a little more careful when he's in New York City because he's learned from San Antonio. The one other thing that's really interesting about being being Mexican in New York in the 1890s, there's only about 300 Mexicans in New York City at that time. So he's pretty free to invent what it means to be Mexican. I mean, no one had really, most people hadn't met a Mexican, so he can embody that for them however he wants to do it.
A question. I'm an early colonialist, and I'm interested in this issue of translation. And I was wondering if you remember his speech. Could you place him at a certain community in Mexico or a certain region when he spoke Spanish?
¿Entendiste la pregunta? ¿Cómo?
I can say I speak Spanish.
Okay. No, I can do it, but ¿cómo fue el acento de tu abuelo en español?
He died when my father was 5, so we didn't.
I mean, it's an interesting question in the sense of how well did he speak Spanish is one of these mysteries for me. There's some letters that he's written in Spanish, that are quite grammatically correct, so that seems to be one clue. And the other clue I have is at one point he's investigated by a private detective who comes and says, I see all these people speaking Spanish, and one of them I recognize was the Mexican William Ellis. And so certainly now how well this private detective spoke Spanish, I don't know, but certainly he was able to kind of seemingly converse with a lot of facility with other Spanish speakers.
My father's accent was awful in Spanish.
Go ahead,
Kirk?
Oh, my only question was, did you know, and this is coming back to the other question, was he basically raising capital for Mexican companies? Like the stock certificates, were they were Mexican companies or were they US companies?
Mexican company.
They were, okay. So he was going to Wall Street and raising capital then, primarily.
To invest in Mexico.
To invest in
Invest in
Mexico,
Mexico.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. They're all pretty much to invest in Mexico. And as Peter was saying, in mines and railroads, electrification. So in Toluca, what they're doing is they're building a dam and they're beginning, Porfirio Diaz is electrifying Mexico City. And so all of the investments are targeted towards the Mexico, but most of the capital at this time comes from the US.
Did you have any idea of how many millions that he raised?
It's tricky, I mean, because these stock certificates, I think sometimes are a little bit, maybe as Peter's experience on Wall Street indicates, they're sometimes aspirational, you know, like I have this company with all these shares that's worth millions, and how much that's really true or not is very hard for me to tell. There is something that I found one of the credit reports, which is to say, where they said he seems like he's incredibly rich, but I really don't know. I do call him a millionaire in the book, and it is true that at one point he actually does own a water company that's worth valued over $1 million. So at least on paper, at one point he had more than $1 million.
But nothing is left.
Nothing is left. Yeah, estuvo. Yeah, se acabó. Yeah.
Are there any plans for a translation of this book into Spanish?
We hope, yeah, that's the hope. I have several colleagues who are Mexicanists who are trying to hook me up with some presses. Not that we'll make any money off of it, but it would be really great to get the story shared in Mexico. Yeah.
On the Mexican side, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, do they know this story?
Now they
Now.
yes. we knew parts of it, but
Because of the
until
book.
we met Carl, then we understood many things.
We're all friends on Facebook.
But the after, maybe I'll end on this point. I mean, this seems like we're sort of coming to a natural close, but do you want to go?
I did want to share one.
Okay, go for it.
James Luval of Luval Commons is a family member as well. The same family, their grandfather and James Luval's mother, Isabel, were brother and sister. So that kind of brings it home to UCLA. There's a UCLA connection as well. So I just wanted to make that connection for you.
But the afterword of the book is basically, a lot of the book is talking about how the border splintered families, including the family. And the afterword of the book is, last year we sort of had a family reunion at Fanny's house. And the idea of coming back together and bridging these borders that have been created.
Yeah, I'm just a little curious about the dynamic between the two families. Like, do you guys know each other well? Like, did you have, you know what I mean? So.
Well, we're getting to know each other very well. And it's interesting, there's something about knowing that it's family. When the first time you meet, there's automatically a bond. You just feel, oh, and then I go like, Peter looks like so-and-so, and he looks like so-and-so. And so, yes, we just wish we, were closer so we could see each other more often. But I think that we just naturally felt a bond. And it's almost like, we had all these pictures to exchange. because we had pictures they didn't have, and they had pictures we didn't have, and so then suddenly you look at all of them and go, oh my God, look, they all, you know, our family, you know, you can see resemblances, and so there's just a really good natural bond feeling.
They have pictures of the same event, maybe 80 years ago, and we have pictures of the same event, but oh, this is the same,
Yeah.
the same party. That's very interesting.
So Peter and his family have come twice before to Los Angeles and spent time with the family. I went down to Baja and spent time with Peter and his wife. Kirk, my cousin and his family,
Raise your hand, Kirk.
went to Mexico City. So
I saw them in.
Angela went to New York. Family members, other family members, why don't you stand up?
Jess?
We're all the family.
Anisha?
Here.
Yeah.
It's all, this is all family.
Yeah.
So
Some other family.
by and by, I mean, there's considerable geographical distance, but there is earnest interest, and we're in touch with each other. We email each other, and over time, I'm sure we'll grow closer.
It's wonderful.
It is.
Thanks to Carl.
All right, so I mean, that seems like a good place to end, and people will hang out here if you want to come up and talk to them. I think that'd be great. But thank you, everyone. Thank you.